I had just come back from my 12-week ultrasound when I heard my husband on the phone in the garage, and the words he said made me stop cold in the middle of our hallway with my coat still on, and my hand pressed flat against my stomach. She can't find out about any of this. Not yet. We need more time. I stood there. I didn't breathe. The garage door was cracked open maybe 2 inches, and through that crack I could see him pacing beside his car, one hand pressed against the back of his neck the way he always did when he was stressed. His voice was low, careful. The voice he used when he thought no one was listening. I backed away from the door, quietly. The way you move when you suddenly realize the house you've been living in is not the house you thought it was. That night, I lay beside him in bed and stared at the ceiling while he slept, and I thought about everything I knew and everything I didn't, and I started to understand that those were 2 very different lists. My name is Tara. I'm 32 years old. I'm a licensed paralegal with 8 years of experience at a family law firm in Mississauga, and I know better than most people what betrayal looks like on paper. I've read hundreds of affidavits, I've organized evidence binders. I've sat across from women in intake interviews who told me things that made my stomach turn, and I always thought, how did she not see it coming? I understand now. You don't see it because you're inside it. Because the person doing it to you is someone who knows exactly how to arrange their face when they look at you. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, grew up in a family with money. Not the kind of money people talk about openly, the quiet kind. His father had built a small chain of commercial real estate holdings across the GTA over 30 years, and the family operated with that particular Canadian restraint that looks like modesty from the outside, but is actually just privacy. His mother had never worked a day since she married into that family. His older brother had been brought into the business at 25, and my husband, the younger son, had spent most of his adult life waiting for his share. We met at a mutual friend's cottage in Muskoka the summer I was 27. He was charming in the way that people from money sometimes are. Not flashy, just easy. Comfortable in rooms. Good at listening, he made me feel chosen, which I now know is a very specific and deliberate feeling that some people are very good at manufacturing. We dated for 2 years. We got married in a small ceremony in Burlington. My parents came down from Sudbury. His family attended with the kind of polite warmth that I mistook for acceptance. We had been trying to get pregnant for almost 3 years before it finally happened. 3 years is a long time to want something. You learn things about yourself in that time. I learned that I was stronger than I thought and more fragile than I wanted to admit, sometimes within the same hour. I learned that hope is not gentle. Hope is actually quite brutal. It comes back every month whether you invite it or not, and every month you have to go through losing it again. When the test finally came back positive, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried for a long time. Not sad crying, the other kind. My husband came in and found me there and held me on the floor of our ensuite in our house in Oakville, and I thought, this is it, this is the life we've been working toward. The 12-week scan showed everything was progressing normally. Strong heartbeat, good measurements. The technician smiled and said I was doing great. I came home to my husband on the phone in the garage. I spent the next 2 days trying to convince myself it was nothing. A work call. A surprise he was planning. Something boring and ordinary that I had accidentally made sinister by the particular mood I was in that afternoon. But I've spent 8 years in family law. I know the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. I started paying attention differently. I noticed that his phone was always face down on the table now. I noticed he'd started taking calls in the car before coming inside. I noticed that his mother had begun texting him more than usual, and whenever she did, he'd read the message and then set the phone down and say nothing, and if I asked who it was, he'd say just mom and change the subject. I noticed that his brother and sister-in-law had come for dinner twice in the past month, which was unusual. They never made the drive from their place in Forest Hill without a reason. And during those dinners, there were moments, small ones, quick, where the 3 of them would exchange a look that closed me out. I couldn't have described it to anyone. It was nothing you could point to. Just a half second of something passing between them that I wasn't meant to catch. I caught it every time. About 5 weeks after the garage phone call, I came home early from work. A client had canceled a deposition. I didn't call ahead. I just drove home, pulled into the driveway, came in through the side door, and heard voices in the kitchen. My husband, his mother, his brother. I stood in the laundry room with my hand on the wall, and I listened. His mother was speaking. Her voice was the same one she used when she was explaining something she considered settled. The lawyer has already drawn up the amendment. If the baby is a boy, everything moves forward as your father intended. If it's a girl, we revisit. But either way, she does not need to be involved in any of this until after. My husband said something I couldn't fully catch. A question, or maybe an objection, so his voice was lower than hers. His brother said, "It doesn't matter what she thinks, she's not a blood relative. She has no standing," his mother said, "Exactly. So we handle this quietly and everyone is fine." I stood very still, my coat was still on. The dryer was running and it had been masking the sound of my entry, and it continued to run, and I stood there while everything I thought I knew rearranged itself into something I didn't recognize. She doesn't need to be involved. No standing. Handle this quietly. I walked back out the way I came. I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine off for 20 minutes. Then I drove to a Tim Hortons 3 streets over and sat in the parking lot and called my best friend. My oldest friend, someone I've known since grade 7 in Sudbury, and I told her what I'd heard. She said, "Tara, you need to talk to a lawyer." I said, "I am a lawyer." "Well, almost," she said. "Not your kind of lawyer, you know what I mean." I did know. Here's what I also knew. I worked in family law. I had colleagues who handled estate disputes. I understood how wills worked, how amendments worked, how the inheritance structures of family trusts operated in Ontario. And I knew that if my husband's father was planning to amend his estate documents to condition an inheritance on the sex of a grandchild, or, worse, to exclude a daughter-in-law entirely from any financial considerations, he had the right to do that. It was ugly. It was the kind of thing I'd seen a dozen times from the other side of the conference table, but it wasn't necessarily criminal. What worried me wasn't the estate planning. What worried me was the phrase "handle this quietly" and the way my husband had stood in our kitchen with his mother and his brother and had not said my name once. I needed to understand exactly what they were planning before I did anything, because if I confronted him too early, he'd close off. He'd minimize. He'd tell me I misheard or misunderstood, and I'd have nothing to contradict him with except my own word against his, and I'd spent enough time in family court to know how that went. So I did what I do professionally. I started building a file. I bought a small notebook from the Shoppers Drug Mart on Lakeshore, and I started writing down dates, times, observations, every unusual phone call, every dinner, every look. I wrote it in point form the way I would for a client, because I needed to treat myself like a client. That was the only way I was going to get through this clearly. I also got my prenatal care transferred, quietly. I told my OB that I wanted to switch to a practice closer to my workplace for convenience, which was partially true. What was fully true was that I didn't want my husband's family doctor, who had been their family doctor for 20 years, anywhere near my pregnancy. I didn't know what they'd told him, I didn't know what he knew. I wasn't taking chances. My new OB was a woman named Dr. O.C. Mensah, and she had a practice in downtown Mississauga near my office. At my first appointment with her, I sat across from her in her office and told her, straight out, that I had concerns about my family situation and that I wanted all information about my pregnancy shared only with me. Not my husband. Not anyone calling on his behalf. Just me. She looked at me steadily and said, "That's your right, we'll document it." That was the moment I exhaled for the first time in weeks. Meanwhile, I kept doing the thing that was hardest, acting normal. I came home, I made dinner, I asked how his day was. I let him put his hand on my stomach and feel the baby move, and I watched his face and I thought about what was underneath it, and I kept all of that in the notebook in my desk drawer at the office. About 2 months into this, I was now nearly 22 weeks along. My colleague at work mentioned offhand that she'd just finished a file involving a family trust dispute in Mississauga. The core of it had been a grandfather who'd amended his trust to exclude a grandchild born to a daughter-in-law from a previous marriage, on the grounds that the child wasn't biologically connected to the family line. The court had partially upheld the amendment and partially struck it down. I asked her to send me the case summary. That night I read it 3 times, and then I started to understand more precisely what my in-laws might actually be structuring. Not just an inheritance amendment. A contingency. Something designed so that if my husband didn't produce a son, or if I was removed from the picture in some way, the money would pass to the brother's side. And my husband, who had been waiting his entire adult life for his share, would lose everything. Which meant my husband wasn't conspiring against me out of cruelty, he was conspiring out of desperation. That made it worse somehow. It meant he'd made a calculation. He'd weighed me against the money, and he'd chosen the money, and he was doing it quietly, and he was doing it while holding my hand at prenatal appointments and asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. I sat with that for 3 days before I made my next move. I called my firm's senior partner, not my direct supervisor, but the one who handled our most complex estate litigation, and I told her I needed to speak with her about a personal matter. I didn't tell her everything. I told her I had reason to believe my husband's family was structuring estate documents in a way that might affect me and my child's interests, and I wanted to understand my legal position. She referred me to an estate litigation lawyer she trusted, a woman with a practice in downtown Toronto. I made the appointment on my lunch break and I took the streetcar over on a Thursday afternoon, and I sat across from her with my notebook and I laid out everything I had. She didn't look alarmed, she looked focused, which was better. "What you're describing," she said, "is not necessarily criminal. But there are several avenues we can explore, particularly around your rights as a spouse under the Family Law Act and around any representations that were made to you during the marriage about shared assets." She asked me whether I had access to any documents, tax filings, property records, business registration documents that might have my name or conspicuously lack it. I did. Because my husband had kept everything in a shared Google Drive. Because he trusted me, or because he'd never thought I'd look at it, or both. I went home that night and I sat at my desk while he watched hockey downstairs, and I went through every document in that folder, and I forwarded the relevant ones to my own personal email and then to my lawyer. I want to say that felt good, like power returning. It didn't. It felt like grief. It felt like I was burying something, but I kept going. My lawyer filed a precautionary notice with the Ontario court, a procedural step that placed a flag on any property transactions associated with my husband's family that might affect my spousal interests. It wasn't a lawsuit, it wasn't a public action. It was quiet and it was protective, and my husband wouldn't know about it unless he or his family tried to complete a specific kind of transfer. They tried to complete that transfer 6 weeks later. I was 30 weeks pregnant by then. My husband had been, if anything, more attentive, more considerate. He'd started leaving early to pick up groceries and coming home with things I hadn't asked for. My favorite crackers, flowers, a book I'd mentioned once in passing. And every time he did something like that, I had to make my face do the right thing, and I had to remind myself that this was someone who was simultaneously sitting across tables with his family and discussing what I didn't need to know. The transfer was flagged. My lawyer called me at the office. She said the family had attempted to complete a property transfer that would have moved a significant asset, a commercial property in Brampton worth approximately $2.4 million, out of a joint family holding into a corporate structure that excluded my husband's name. It was, she explained, exactly the kind of pre-inheritance manipulation that the precautionary notice was designed to catch. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," she said, "we send a letter." The letter, when it went out, was quiet and formal and extremely specific. It referenced the transaction. It referenced the Family Law Act. It referenced my husband's entitlement as a spouse with a pregnant partner. It made clear that any further movement of assets that might be construed as affecting my family's financial interests would result in immediate litigation. My husband called me from the driveway that night. I could see him through the window, pacing. I watched him pace for about 4 minutes before he came inside. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and he looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. He said, "You knew?" I said, "Yes." He said, "For how long?" I said, "Long enough." There was a silence that lasted a while, the kind of silence that means something is ending. "My father's will," he started. I said, "I know what it says, or I know what they wanted it to say." He looked at the table. He looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been told he could put it down, except he wasn't relieved. He looked like someone who understood that putting it down meant facing what it was. He said, "They told me it was the only way. That if I didn't go along with it, I'd be cut out entirely. 30 years of expecting something and suddenly being told it's contingent on things you can't control." I said, "So you decided to not tell me?" He said, "I didn't know what to do." I said, "That's not a defense. That's a description of a choice you made." He didn't say anything to that. I want to be honest about what came next, because the story in my head was simpler than what actually happened. In my version, I was clear and decisive and entirely composed. In reality, I cried. I cried a lot. Not because I was weak, but because I had loved this person, and I had wanted this baby with him, and I had spent 28 weeks growing a life inside my body while simultaneously building a legal case against his family, and that is an exhausting and heartbreaking thing to have been doing at the same time. He reached across the table at some point, and I moved my hand away. In the weeks that followed, I did something that surprised even me. I didn't leave immediately. I stayed. Not because I was confused and not because I forgave him. I want to be very clear about that, but because I was 32 weeks pregnant and I had a plan and the plan was still in motion, and disrupting my housing situation before the baby arrived was not in my interest or the baby's. I called my parents. That was the first time I told my mother any of it, and her response was immediate and practical. She booked a train ticket from Sudbury for the following weekend and she came and stayed for 3 weeks, and having her in the house changed something in the air. It reminded me that there were people in my life who were fully on my side with no complexity attached. My husband's family went quiet after the letter. His mother did not come to the house. His brother did not call. The holiday weekend visit that had been tentatively planned was cancelled without explanation. My husband went to work and came home and existed in the house with the particular careful silence of someone who has been told by their lawyer to say very little. His lawyer had, in fact, told him to say very little. I knew this because family law is a small professional world in the GTA, and sometimes people know things they shouldn't through channels that are technically indirect. The estate matter moved forward through the legal process slowly, the way all legal processes do. What emerged over time was a picture I hadn't fully anticipated. The amendments my in-laws had been trying to make to the family trust were not just about the sex of the grandchild. They were about removing my husband from direct inheritance and routing assets through a corporate structure that would benefit the brother's family exclusively, all on the grounds that my husband had failed to secure the family's continuity interests, according to language that my lawyer described with admirable understatement as legally creative. My father-in-law, it turned out, was not entirely aware of what his wife and older son had been structuring in his name. He was 71 and had recently had a series of small health issues, and there were questions, serious ones, about whether the amendments had been properly authorized or whether signatures had been obtained under circumstances that would not survive scrutiny. That became a separate legal matter. Not mine to pursue, but one that the family's own internal dynamics eventually brought forward. My daughter was born on a Tuesday in March in a delivery room at Trillium Health Partners in Mississauga. My mother was there. My best friend drove down from Sudbury and arrived approximately 40 minutes after the delivery, slightly breathless, with Tim Hortons coffee she hadn't had time to finish. My husband was in the waiting room. He had asked to be present and I had said no, and I understood that that was a hard thing for him, and I also understood that I had run out of capacity to manage hard things on other people's behalf. She was 7 pounds 2 ounces, she had a lot of dark hair. She made a sound in the first few seconds that I will never be able to describe adequately, only that it rearranged something in my chest permanently. I held her and I thought, I did this right. Whatever else was broken, I did this part right. My husband and I separated formally 4 months after my daughter was born. The process was, as these things go, relatively orderly, largely because both our lawyers were professional, and because the estate complications had already made both families interested in minimizing further legal exposure. I received a settlement that reflected my spousal rights under Ontario law, including a share of the property assets that had been in play during the marriage. My daughter's interests were documented and protected. He sees her. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters. She has a father. He is not a monster, he is someone who made a choice I cannot forgive, but who loves his daughter in a way that is real and present, and she deserves to have that. I have had to hold those two things at the same time, and some days that is easier than others. His mother has never apologized, I did not expect her to. His brother and I have not spoken since. His father, and this surprised me more than anything, sent a card when my daughter was born. Just a card, nothing in it except his name and a short line saying he was glad she was healthy. I don't know what that meant. I don't know if it was guilt or decency or something else. I kept the card in the same notebook where I'd written all my observations, which felt like the right place for it. I went back to work when my daughter was 11 months old. My manager had held my position, which I am grateful for every day. I still work in family law. I sit across from people who are going through the worst versions of the stories they thought their lives were going to be, and I help them build files. I help them think clearly. I help them understand what they have standing to do. And sometimes, when someone sits across from me and says, I don't know if I'm overreacting, I'm probably overreacting, I look at them and I say, you probably aren't. Trust what you noticed, write it down, and get someone in your corner before you need them. Because that's the thing they don't tell you. You don't have to wait until everything falls apart to protect yourself. You can do it quietly, calmly, while the dryer is running and your coat is still on. You can start the same afternoon you found out. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep your eyes open and your records clean, and let the facts speak for themselves when the time comes. My daughter is 16 months old now. She has started walking, with enormous confidence and very poor judgment about furniture corners, and she thinks the cat is the funniest thing she has ever encountered in her life. Every morning she wakes up and makes a sound like she's genuinely delighted to discover that the world is still there. I know exactly how she feels.